that many people overlooked the 365 GT4, which was produced alongside the Daytona. The two cars share many of the same components and traits. However, the Ferrari factory produced over 1,200 of the striking Daytona, but a mere 505 examples of the C4 ever rolled out of the factory in 1971 and 72. They share the same Colombo V12, but having less than half the production numbers, the C4 is, in my opinion, an overlooked and undervalued Enzo-era Ferrari. Unfair that the C4 was produced right next to the Daytona, because the Daytona was such a massive hit that it took away a little bit from the C4, which does share so many different components of the Daytona that they're very comparable driving experiences. Now, even in the body design, they are similar. Obviously, the C4 is the 2+2 version. Now, one of the big kind of stick out things on the C4 is the nose. So on this car, it's been painted to match the body, but traditionally, the nose on the C4 is the black rubber bumper. And this car was released in 1971 at the Geneva Auto Show. In the early 70s, a lot of manufacturers had a really hard time of things because of the new bumper laws. When you see a lot of early 70s cars, mid 70s cars with the big, gaudy rubber bumpers, that was the DOT and transportation regulations that made those mandatory in new cars. But they've done a nice job integrating it in this car. Even when it is black, like it traditionally is, it's not too big and it doesn't stick out too much, like some of the Porsches and Lamborghinis of that age. It was a nice mix and a nice way to incorporate those bumper laws without having it stick out too much. When the C4 was first produced, they were also making the Dino and the Daytona. And if you look at just pure production numbers, they made about 1,200 or 1,400 of the Daytonas and about 3,500, 3,700 of the Dinos, but only 505 of the C4. So in that time frame, it is by far the most rare of the road-going Ferraris. And actually, incredibly, when they were new, they were selling for about $3,000 more than the Daytona. Now, one of the things I always find interesting, so the serial number range on the C4 goes from like the 14,000s to the 16,000s. They all end in an odd number. Enzo decided to have all his road-going cars end in odd numbers and all his race cars end in even numbers. And that is true of the Daytona as well. They all have an odd number at the end. Enzo made a choice with the Dino, and because the Dino was a mid-engine V6 and not one of his beloved front-engine V12 Ferraris, he wanted to kind of separate it. So he made the Dino serial numbers end in even numbers. All the road-going Ferraris, odd numbers. Race cars, even numbers, except for the Dino, which got thrown into the even number category. And that went on until roughly the time of the F40s and the Testarossas, and then they did odd and even for all cars because they were basically running out of numbers. The C4 actually has a whole bunch of advantages that make it a really comfortable drive. First off, unlike the Daytona, which has the transaxle in the rear, the C4 has it more traditionally mounted to the back of the engine. And since it's a front engine car, that means that the trans is basically under right here. And so shifting is really easy and smooth. Just a fun fact, it doesn't have a gated shifter. So none of the C4s had your traditional gated plate for the shift. Another thing that makes the C4 just such an amazing drive is the Daytonas, some of them, a lot of them, don't have power steering. They are very heavy at low speeds, especially when I'm trying to back them up in the showroom or for anywhere kind of low and tight spots, parallel parking. It's very difficult. It's really an arm workout. But the C4s all came with power steering. So they're much easier to move and maneuver around, especially at low speeds. As I mentioned, the Daytona and the C4 are very similar in a lot of ways. So they both share the same basic chassis and they both have the Colombo V12 engine. But the big difference, you can see it right away, is the Daytona has the downdraft carburetors, whereas the C4 has these side draft carburetors, and they have modified dual overhead cams that allow the intakes to be positioned differently, so it has these side draft carbs. And it really produces such an amazing noise. In my opinion, the C4 is one of the best sounding Ferraris that has ever been produced. This car is the 365 GTC4. So 365 stands for 365 cc's per cylinder times the 12 cylinders. And then GT, Grand Touring, C for this car stands for coupe. And what I find interesting is, like on the Daytona, it's GTB, and the B stands for Berlinetta, which is also a coupe, but they use the B for their more sporty coupes, and they use the C for their four-seater coupes. And then 4 for the 4-cam. So that's the naming system of Ferrari, and I just always find it so interesting. One of the most well-known names as a body designer for Ferrari for a long time has been Pininfarina. There was the C4, the Dino, and the Daytona, which were all designed by Pininfarina. But the Daytona and the Dino were actually both built, the bodies were built by Scaglietti, whereas the C4 was designed and built by Pininfarina. As everyone knows, Ferraris are well known for having hand-built bodies. So back in 1958, was the year that Enzo Ferrari added the first assembly line to the factory. And in 1960, he added a second assembly line. And in that era, they were producing the 250s, so the PF coupes, PF cabs. That's when they really started ramping up their production, so they needed the assembly lines. And when these cars were built, there was one side of the factory that was assembling the Dinos, and then the other side of the factory was assembling the C4s and the Daytonas. So they each had their own line they were rolling off of. If you look at old photos, the cars were even rolled down the assembly line by hand. Nowadays, it's all machine working, and it does make it more uniform and kind of, perfect, but it takes away some of the charm of the hand-built aspect of the car. For instance, if you have these old cars and you need a new hood for whatever reason, well, it's not guaranteed to fit, even though it came off the same model car. Because they were hand-built, they have little tweaks and differences, making them almost impossible to match up. So you'll have to modify the different components in order to fit. And that's what I love about hand-built cars, is those little tweaks and differences that make them stand out. When Road and Track reviewed the C4 in 1972, they said something along the lines of, it is a clean, graceful, and understated design, and one may say it's a Ferrari for mature enthusiasts. And I happen to agree, because while the Daytona is a very striking, aggressive looking car, and the Dino is very curvaceous and a sexy car, the C4 does not lack the power or performance of the Daytona, but you also get the comfort. You really can't say that it doesn't have the power you need, because it has a top speed of over 160 miles an hour. And in 1972, that's pretty fast. It's much like the Daytona, it is a freight train when it gets going, but it's just a freight train that's a lot easier to handle and maneuver, and it has more luggage space, it has a decent sized trunk, it has everything you could want as a good Grand Touring car. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video and learned a little something about the Ferrari C4. If you like this, then please subscribe and stay tuned, because we got a lot more content coming very soon.